if you wait around until your classmates begin to die, and you will have classmates who will die from this, then it's going to be too late for you to go back and protect yourself. Well, I hope I've made it perfectly clear that every single one of you who chooses to be involved and sexually active needs to worry about AIDS. I should include a brief note concerning the problems of AIDS and young gay people. While the gay community has made great strides in slowing the spread of AIDS through education, there are still segments of that population which are very difficult to reach. In particular, there are heavily closeted people, and most especially, there are young people who begin often to explore their sexuality before they've learned the facts of how to protect themselves. And I can only hope that my being here today may help ensure that none of you need to return to Pinecrest in a few years to tell another generation of Pinecrest students about your experiences with AIDS. In conclusion, I'd like to return to my outline from a year ago, in which I intended to finish somewhat dramatically with the conclusion that the only way to survive a crisis of this sort is to grow from it. Grow deeper, grow stronger. You know, during most of the last year, that conclusion has struck me as pretty naive. I mean, I'd faced many challenges that I wasn't ready for. And I certainly hadn't felt very strong. But now, with time, that sense of strength is coming back. I do feel stronger. Physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Am I strong enough to deal with what the future holds for me? That I don't know. What I do know is that I was strong enough to come back here today. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a pretty good start. My understanding of the format is that we're now going to have some question and answers. And then at the end of the period, there will be a break, and some of you will be back, again, third period, for additional question and answers. A couple things. At the break between the sessions, first of all, I have a reprint of a New York Times article that some of you may find interesting. I only brought 250 copies, not planning on this size of turnout. But anyone who's interested can pick that up, I believe, from Mrs. Judavine between the sessions. And I also have a few pictures here that were taken at the AIDS Quilt, which many of you have heard about. There was an HBO special on it just last month, which contains panels, each designed by the family or friends of someone who has died, and which was all together in Washington last month, all 14 acres and 10,000 panels of it. And some of you may find those interesting to look at briefly. Any questions? You may want to stand up. You don't have to, though. I'm in a long-term monogamous relationship with someone who has not been exposed to the virus. I still have sex with him, but it's not intercourse. The motto of the safe sex movement is on me, not in me. So yes, I have sex, but not sex that involves a risk of the transmission of AIDS. It's got to be easier after that one.
Best care for AIDS patients in New York, since you decided to stay in New York, where do you feel?
In general, the highest concentration of AIDS experts tend to be in the cities that have the highest rate of AIDS, which are New York, San Francisco, LA, and Miami. I know there's a very fine AIDS unit in Miami. New York, certainly you can argue that it has the finest doctors. And I know that I have one of the single finest doctors in all of New York. And the hospital which he is associated with, NYU Hospital, is very arguably the finest AIDS group in the country, which involves, because so much of the AIDS involves the different side infections. So I both have my main doctor, who is an expert, but last fall when I got into the severe AIDS-related intestinal difficulties, immediately they called in perhaps the finest AIDS gastroenterologist in New York, who was there with the full knowledge of the newest experimental treatments. So I'm very happy with the treatment I'm getting up there.
Have you found that most people shy away from you when they find out?
I'm certainly aware that that's happened with a lot of AIDS patients. No, that's not been my experience. The question was, do you find that people shy away from you when they find out that you have AIDS? In my case, as the word has gotten out, people have tended to show up at my doorstep to give me support. I had one good friend from high school who basically seemed to disappear when the word was sent out. He called about 2 weeks ago to apologize and to tell me that I could count on him in the future. Okay, I am not practicing full-time. I give a lot of credit to law for the collapse of my immune system. The New York practice is tremendously pressured, tremendously tense, and tension and stress is believed to have an awful lot of impact on the immune system. So I did not and will not for quite a while return to a full-time practice. But my law firm has been tremendously supportive, both because they have a tremendously strong disability plan, which is essential since so many AIDS patients deal with horrendous financial difficulties, and because they even went out of their way to create a part-time position where I could work 3 days a week, really as many hours as I want. This last month, preparing for this speech, I've done almost no work at all, and that's been fine. But if nothing else, I find that it's important to have some continuing connection and involvement to the field of my career. Because I found that last December, during some of those darkest days, I was most worried and most obsessed, not about AIDS, but about how I was ever going to put my life back together if and when I begin to regain my health. I was convinced I would never be able to return to law, and that all my security and all my plans for the future would be crushed. I even was obsessed for quite a while with how I was going to retire someday, which is a pretty strange thing for somebody with a fatal illness. And I find that being involved with the legal practice, even if it's only to a limited extent, continues to remind me that I will be able to return to it. And if I get through this, I will be able to rebuild my life. It's also important because it keeps me busy. And I find that it's important to be busy. You don't necessarily want to be under a lot of stress, but you don't want to give yourself too much chance to think about it each day. And at work, I have a tremendous number of supportive friends as well. And spend my days with them helps a lot. That I was gay. I had been hinting to my mother for some time. I told them at different times. I took a term off during law school, mainly to see to it that I could graduate mid-year, which would give me a chance to travel around the world for 6 months before beginning practice. But during that term off, my main project was to tell my parents. I only got through one of them. But I had been hinting to her for some time that there would be that there was something out there that she needed to know. And let me pause for a second. We'll come back to this. Return to it, I want to tell a story. A condom story. And it's all Mrs. Gross's fault. The story begins in honors biology sophomore year, during the infamous chapter 13, human reproduction. Near the end of the chapter, Mrs. Gross, the one with the red face there, gave a lecture on birth control, the highlight of which was at the end when she pulled out a number of visual aids. Specifically, she had a pack of multicolored red and green condoms, which, she insisted, her husband had gotten as a handout at a gynecologist convention. As it turned out, almost exactly the same group of people took AP biology during our senior year. And as we reached the relevant chapter, we noticed the same subject matter appearing on the outline. And well, we understood how a discussion of the brain or the pancreas could be made more sophisticated for an AP class. But we didn't know how she was going to further elaborate on birth control. And so after school one day, a group of us decided that something needed to be done to liven up that presentation. And in particular, we decided that Mrs. Gross needed a supplement to her visual aids collection. Specifically, we decided that she needed a pack of Rough Rider studded condoms. And someone, I think it was Pete Grossons, decided that it would be funnier still if we could talk the most innocent person in our class to go and pick them up. And it was a close call, of course, between Jim Judavine and myself, but I received the honors. And so I slowly slinked down Cypress towards the corner of 18th and Commercial to the Eckerts. And I spent I spent about a half hour casing the joint, convinced that lurking behind every aisle was either somebody I knew or, more horribly, someone my mother knew. Eventually, I decided that the place was clean and began preparing for a time when the line in the checkout counter was as short as possible. Then I saw my moment. I grabbed the pack and I sprinted to the line. I jumped in line, and immediately a mother and her 6-year-old child leapt in line behind me. I got to the front. I was palming them in my hand like this, and I kind of slithered my hand up on the counter and pulled my hand away. The clerk looked down, chuckled for a second, and lifted them up over his head. He called out to the manager on the far side of the store, "Hey, Joe, any tax on these?" The manager squints for a second and calls back, "Yeah, entertainment tax." And I'm here today to tell you that while it's unlikely that you're going to have an experience as bad as me, you will, if you do, someday look back on it and laugh. Now, I believe when the period ended, the question on the floor was, how did my parents react when they found out that I was gay? And I said that I told them at separate times. Her mom, I had been getting ready to tell her for a while, and I was confident that I was going to not, by that point, that I was not going to be rejected. I should back up and say very clearly that when I was in high school, I was very convinced that if they ever found out I was gay, that they would disown me, as I thought that my teachers and every one of my friends would do the same. But by the time I got around to telling my mother, I was pretty confident that it would be well received. And I'd gotten pretty sloppy at that point. You know, I'd leave matchboxes from, you know, a gay bar in my desk drawer, and she'd stumble across them. And so I knew that the idea had crossed her mind. And eventually I had kind of began to start some serious conversations with her several times, and finally she sat me down and said, "Tim, is there something you want to tell me?" And I did, and we cried, and she hugged, and has been tremendously supportive. I told my father about a year later, and without meaning to embarrass him, the reason I told him was that the morning before I told him, we were driving on a trailer trip up through New Hampshire, I believe at the time. And in the car, I was discussing some of the latest Broadway plays. And I mentioned the #1 hit at the time, which was La Cage aux Folles, which had a gay theme to it. And my father at the steering wheel said, "I don't want to see any damn play about faggots raising children." And I said that the sun is not going to set, to myself, that the sun is not going to set tonight before we have a talk. And so I told him. He also has been very supportive. I think in ways it's often very difficult for the father to deal with first, but he made it very clear from day one that I was his son and that he loved me with all of his heart and soul. And I think over the intervening few years, he's come to be much more comfortable with the arrangement and with me. Any other questions? Pain? No, not at the moment. The surgery took a long time to recover from. When you have an incision that runs from your rib cage to your groin and is vertical, it is very rough because there's almost no movement you can make, you know, whether it's standing up, sitting down, or turning, that doesn't twist your abdomen. But it has healed. I still have, I guess my intestinal problems continue. Which is very inconvenient, and at times that even gets painful. but it's not a constant thing for me. There are certain things you can develop with AIDS that are a constant pain, like there's a rare form of skin cancer that is very prevalent among AIDS patients, which often involves a fair amount of pain. The question was, you are deeply religious and homosexual. Is there a contradiction there? It's interesting that supposed contradiction is what I've spent the bulk of my life dealing with. It has been the most difficult and the most important thing that I've ever struggled with. Homosexuality or sexual orientation, period, is believed by a very large consensus of experts, psychologists and psychiatrists at this point, to be determined before the age of 5, and not to involve any sort of conscious choice by the individual. In fact, even a group as conservative as the Catholic Church, at this point in time, has acknowledged that there is such a thing as a homosexual orientation, which at times is incapable of being changed. In resolving it for myself, there have been, well, the result of that is that the religious background and the strength of the religious convictions with which you grow up has no effect on the likelihood that you may turn out to be gay. There are gay fundamentalists, gay Catholics, gay atheists, gay Hasidic Jews, and so on and so forth. And nothing that your church says or your parents says or your culture says or anything else has any, or that I say, will have any impact on that. How I came to grips with it, well, first of all, today is a much easier question for me because I have a loving gay relationship, which is the most important thing in my life. I have somebody who would die for me and for whom I would die. And to tell me at this point in time that this relationship, which I have experienced as being holy, as being the most sacred and holy thing in my life, to tell me that that is somehow evil is at some level to me just ludicrous. But that's today. That was not the case in Pinecrest. I guess the first step that helped me in coming to grips with my religion and my sexuality was coming to understand the fact that it wasn't a choice and that 10% of the world has, across cultures and throughout history, always been gay. And I guess my conception of a loving God is such that I couldn't imagine that a loving God would have created 10% of his creation gay just in order to laugh at their sexual frustration. And that was the starting point. Once I began to come out and began to read a lot more, I can also deal better with some of the actual biblical and religious arguments on the subject, which get a little bit, which I'm not going to get into full detail. First of all, the Catholic Church that I grew up in is not a fundamentalist church. There may be some here who are fundamentalists, which believe that every word of the Bible is the literal truth from God. My church did not teach me that. And there are many things that I and most Americans disagree with in the Bible. Everything from Paul's scriptures about it being unnatural for men to wear long hair, to the role of women in the Bible, to Paul's belief that abstinence is at least, if not required, at least preferable within marriage. And I've done a lot of reading of the research that's been done in the last 2 decades, most specifically by John McNeill, the Jesuit scholar. His book, The Church and the Homosexual, and in John Boswell, the respected Yale historian's work, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, which discuss things like the actual references that people consider to be the base of our religious objections to homosexuality. The Bible was not written in modern English. It was written first, the Old Testament in ancient Hebrew, and the New Testament in ancient Greek. And there are massive problems of translations with both of those languages. And I would say that virtually all of the references to, or the supposed references to homosexuality can be attacked as not being valid interpretations. And in some cases, I think they're pretty clearly willfulness interpretations. One example of that is that the King James Version often translates as sodomy, a term which best translated means is the male form of temple prostitute. There were idolatrous religions at the time that the Old Testament was written that had temple prostitutes, both male and female. But over time, since the temple prostitutes have become a somewhat irrelevant issue, people began to interpret and those phrases as meaning sodomy, and they don't say that. And finally, the concept or understanding that homosexuality is a sexual orientation didn't exist at the time. The authors of the Bible did not know that there were such things as people who were naturally inclined to be gay. See, it's getting easier. I see more hands.
What does the 8 stand for?
An important basic question. What does AIDS stand for? It is the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And that definition is both important and interesting. There has been, in this epidemic, about a dozen different names for AIDS. At first it was called, or the first big name was the, was GRID, the gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome. It's important that it's treated as a syndrome. They discovered that there was something going on. And the way the crisis started is that there were some very rare diseases which very seldom happened. And when they did happen, usually happened in things like transplant patients who, because of the transplants, have to take medication which suppress their immune system, or in very elderly people. And suddenly, a lot of young people started coming down with these diseases that were opportunistic infections, which means that they prey on a suppressed immune system. And we had those before we ever discovered that there was an AIDS virus. It took years to find the virus that was causing the collapse of the immune system. And because of that, for years the definition of AIDS was the presence of a suppressed immune system combined with one or more of these usually fatal diseases. Once they found the virus, AIDS continued to be technically defined as the presence of the virus plus one or more of these diseases. So that even people who have the AIDS virus usually are not technically called AIDS patients until they collect one or more of the opportunistic infections.
Is there any place you feel comfortable going
with Stephen. You got halfway through that, and I was convinced you were going to ask me if there was any place I was afraid to go because I had a suppressed immune system. So I had my answer already ready, and you blocked me. The question is there any place where I would feel uncomfortable going with Stephen, my gay lover? Not too much. Stephen comes down for Christmas with our family. I go to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with his family. I sat in a place of honor at his sister's wedding this summer. And I very much tried to talk him into coming down this weekend to my 10th high school reunion. And in fact, he was set up to go and then wimped out at the last minute. Not because of embarrassment about his sexuality, but because he in general is kind of a, I don't know, I call him antisocial. He's brilliant, hysterically funny, but shy around strangers. His greatest fear in life, is to wake up in the middle of a cocktail party. And the idea of following me around for the weekend talking about old football stories